strategic analyst in the Office of National Assessment, and where his work mostly dealt with nuclear strategy and arms control, ballistic missile defence, North Asian strategic affairs, and weapons of mass destruction terrorism. He's also worked on arms control policy in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as an analyst in the DIO, Defence Intelligence Organisation. He writes for newspapers and magazines both in Australia and around the world, and is a regular commentator on the Lowy Institute's digital magazine, The Interpreter, which was the founding editor from 2007 to 2014. So a really important issue, and I think you chose this topic before the meeting with the President of North Korea and the President of the United States. So it'll be very interesting to see your take on what, if anything, came out of that meeting. So can I now ask Sam to come up to the stage and give his presentation on North Korea and the Twilight leadership?
I should start actually by just noting that I'm not here in the guise of being a Korea expert. I know we have several of those in the room, including someone who I met earlier who actually visited North Korea just a couple of years ago. It was fascinating to hear about that. My approach to this subject is, well, as you can guess a little bit from my background, is geostrategic. That's international politics and international strategy is really my background, and so inevitably I come at this from a kind of, if you like, a chessboard perspective, and that has its weaknesses, of course. It means you aren't as well versed as country experts are in the local nuances. So keep that in mind as you listen. That is something that perhaps weakens my analysis in particular respects. So I am taking this very high-level approach to this problem, which doesn't take very much into account the local politics of the situation as much as would be the case if I was a country expert. I guess the other thing to keep in mind in introduction is to say that I'm going to give a very pessimistic analysis here of the Korea situation, and in particular of America's position on the Korean Peninsula and in Asia generally. I think America's position is very much weaker than most analysts would assess. The ultimate pessimistic scenario here, of course, would be to say that there's going to be a nuclear war. I won't go that far, but my pessimism, short of that, is actually pretty deep. I think to understand why the North Korea problem is so significant for Australia and for the US, and why America's position is so perilous, we need to tie together two stories about Asian geopolitics, the big one and the small one. The small one is North Korea, and the big one is China, the rise of China. So I'm going to talk about both of those in a moment, but first I just want to zoom out very briefly to look at America's place in the world and its place in Asia since the end of the Cold War. Let me just grab myself some water here.
The lunch wasn't that good.
Pardon?
The lunch wasn't that good.
The bread was dry. So let me just start with a very quick, broad assessment of America's place, how America sees itself in the world and its place in Asia. During the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Cold War really defined America's place in the world, and it established itself as being the leader of global anti-communist forces. It was really, I think we can say without too much fear of contradiction, the animating spirit of US foreign policy was the fight against communism. After the Cold War ended, US leadership became unchallenged and unprecedented in scale, in relative scale. So the US became what was then sometimes referred to as a hyperpower, not just a superpower, but a hyperpower, bestriding the global stage like a colossus. This was also referred to as the unipolar moment in American foreign policy. As a result, of course, the US had the luxury of addressing problems that it really couldn't afford to address before, and so the focus of American foreign policy shifted, dealing with transnational issues, removing trade barriers, responding to state failure, climate change, etc. international norms began to shift towards foreign intervention for humanitarian purposes. So we had a huge surge in UN peacekeeping operations after 1989, for instance. Somalia in 92, the Iraqi no-fly zones to protect the Kurds, Yugoslavia in the late 90s, Timor, of course, in Australia's instance. But then, of course, we had 9/11, and the US focus moved to another transnational issue, terrorism. However, the emphasis on rebuilding broken nations abroad remained. The US didn't just try to defeat Al-Qaeda, it tried to rebuild Afghanistan and Iraq from the ground up as democratic societies, and ultimately, I think we can say now those efforts failed. In Asia, on the other hand, terrorism never really became an animating purpose for the US as a regional leader, not in the way it did in the Middle East at least. Southeast Asia is a partial exception to that. Really, what sustained American leadership in Asia after the Cold War was not so much the fight against terrorism, it was just that there wasn't anything to put an end or to question America's leadership in Asia. So America stayed in Asia and remained the leader in Asia simply because its allies wanted it, and the US didn't really have to bear much of a burden to meet their needs. There was nothing to challenge the US-led order that Washington had built during the Cold War, and everybody benefited from it, including China. Now, of course, that ground is starting to shift. And I'd argue that there are four things that have brought us to the present moment in which American power in our region is eroding. First is the end of the Cold War, which robbed the United States of an animating purpose in Asia. Second is the failure of the war on terrorism, which exposed the limits of American arms and of American power, and imposed huge material and reputational costs. The third is the rise of China. This is the biggest one, massive really, and I'll go into more detail about that later. And the fourth factor is more recent. North Korea, although that's an old problem, but more recently, in particular, North Korea's development of an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, and in a moment I'll go into detail about why that particular factor is so important. So, how does North Korea fit into that big picture about the changing American role in the world? As I said, I think we need to tie together two parts of the story of modern Asia here, a big one and a small one. The big one, as I said, is the rise of China, and the smaller one is North Korea and its development of nuclear weapons, and in particular, the fact that Pyongyang now is on the cusp of deploying an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, if it hasn't already. The ICBM is a devilishly difficult problem for America because it has the potential to split the US from its allies. So China, as I said, is the Leviathan in this story, and it's the core reason behind America's perilous place in Asia. But the ICBM, North Korean ICBM, exacerbates that change, and I think has the capacity to really initiate a collapse in America's position in the region. So why is the ICBM important? Well, first of all, experts still disagree about exactly how reliably North Korea can fire a nuclear-tipped missile with the range to hit cities in the continental US. North Korea thus far has only staged 3 ICBM tests, and we can't be sure that it's even capable of miniaturising a nuclear warhead to fit in the nose cone of an ICBM, nor can we be sure, even if they could miniaturise it, whether the warhead would actually survive a re-entry. That may actually not matter very much. All that matters is that the possibility of a North Korean ICBM is now so great that America has to behave as if it is already a fact. And of course, I think America already is responding. The ICBM is the weapon that led President Trump to threaten North Korea with fire and fury. And it's now led him to an unprecedented level of summitry, such as we saw in Singapore just a couple of months ago. Why does the ICBM matter so much? Well, it's not because North Korea is going to suddenly launch nuclear strikes against the United States. We know enough about North Korea's behaviour to know that reasonable level of assurance, at least, that it's a fairly rational actor, and it knows that any direct attack on the United States would bring a massive, overwhelming response from the United States that would put an end to the North Korean regime and also cause unfathomable fatalities really in the north. So it would trigger a devastating response from the US. And there's ample evidence that Kim Jong-un is rational enough to avoid doing anything that would lead to certain demise. I think the true significance of the ICBM is that it leads to a phenomenon among America's Asian allies that strategists call decoupling. When North Korea can credibly threaten to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans in an instant, America's allies start to worry that US guarantees to defend them in the event of North Korean aggression suddenly appears less credible. It's one thing, of course, for the United States to put its armed forces in harm's way. They base them in Japan and in South Korea, where they could easily be at risk from North Korea's forces. But would the US really be prepared to risk Los Angeles, for instance, to save Seoul? Those kind of questions are going to start needling away at America's allies in the region, including Australia, over time. Now, the United States has faced this problem before, this problem of decoupling. It faced it during the Cold War in the late 50s and the early 60s, when the Soviets first developed the capability to strike the American mainland, the American homeland directly. And at that time, Washington had to convince its allies in Europe that it was still committed to Europe's defence. How they did it was that they based smaller nuclear weapons on European soil, and then they integrated their NATO allies into the command structure for those nuclear forces, thus knitting the allies closer together. That won't work this time. First of all, there are practical problems with the Americans putting nuclear weapons back on South Korean soil. I won't go into that, but one of them is purely the politics. The South Koreans themselves are very reluctant to have nuclear weapons based on their soil again. But even if the practical problems can be overcome, the bigger problem is simply that North Korea is not the Soviet Union. North Korea isn't a global existential threat to American interests and values. Remember where I began, which is that during the Cold War, the Soviet threat was the single organising principle, not just for American defence and foreign policy, for space policy, for education, for science and technology. It was really a national effort to win the struggle against Soviet-led communism. But North Korea, far from being the leader of an ideological movement with global ambitions, it's an isolated, an insular throwback. It's a vestige of the Cold War that's been left behind by history. It's got an economy roughly the size of Laos, and its conventional military capabilities are third rate. So what I'm arguing is that without the Cold War to give the North Korean problem a larger context, Pyongyang is, by all objective measures, just not that important to the United States. And I think America's Asian allies, primarily South Korea and Japan, but Australia too, deep down in their hearts, they know this. And that's why North Korea's ICBM is such a crucial development, because it exposes the fact that America's interests on the Korean Peninsula are nowhere near as significant as these allies may have hoped, and certainly nowhere near as significant as they used to be during the Cold War. And those interests no longer anchor the US to the region as they used to. Now, that argument relies on a reasonably narrow reading of American interests, much narrower than the reading that's been taken by recent US presidents and by many people in the foreign policy establishment in the United States. And that establishment is very much devoted to the idea of America's continuing its role as global hegemon and as a leader in the Asia-Pacific region. The end of the Cold War has really not shifted that worldview very much at all for those people. But I would argue that I think for many ordinary Americans that worldview has shifted, and clearly Trump's election signals a change in that worldview among a large portion of the American electorate. So my argument here is is that Korea, the Korean Peninsula, is far less important than the United States, than it used to be to the United States. And the foreign policy establishment in the United States would argue that weakening the alliance with North Korea and weakening America's other alliances in Asia would be a blow to the US, to US interests around the world and to the rules-based international order that it champions. The question is how big a blow? And I think when you ask that question, you really get to the heart of why the United States is probably, is now in a very weak position. So during the Cold War, the question was easy to answer. Why is Asia, why are America's Asian alliances so important? That was an easy answer because it was engaged in a global struggle to defeat communism. That was the animating purpose behind America's global network of alliances and military bases, including in Asia and in Australia. But as I've already argued, after European communism collapsed, America ceased to have a real animating purpose behind its alliance network in Asia. Nevertheless, the alliance network remained in place because there was nothing really to challenge it. In China, America now faces a true peer competitor in Asia. According to the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, by 2030, China's economy could be worth 42.4 trillion US dollars versus 24 trillion for the US economy. So, by 2030, DFAT reckons, or the Australian government reckons, China's economy will be almost twice the size of that of the United States. It's impossible, I think, to imagine a nation of that size and of that stature accepting that it will remain second to the United States in its own region. Just as Washington refused to allow foreign powers to dominate its environment when it rose to great power status, China will want the same in the Asia Pacific. So when America now asks itself how much it values its position in Asia, the issue is no longer abstract. It now has to ask, if we think this is so important, what costs are we prepared to pay to defend it? In the early post-Soviet period, the costs weren't very high, but America now needs to defend its status against the largest economy in the world, a nation that's on track to build a navy on a par with the US by 2030, which has got a home ground advantage in Asia, rather than operating on foreign soil, and which is highly motivated to displace the US as the leading regional power. To me, it is far from clear that America is willing to pay the price of that leadership, which would require a sustained, multi-decade effort, at least as intensive and wide-ranging as the struggle against Soviet communism. I think the reason why it's hard to imagine America making that kind of sacrifice is that China, unlike the Soviet Union, doesn't present a global threat to American interests and values. True, it's an economic juggernaut, and it has leadership ambitions in our region, but it doesn't have any evident ambitions to bury the US, as Khrushchev once threatened. And also, it's enmeshed in a global economy in a way that makes it impossible to isolate. Now, of course, the ambition that I talked about may yet grow from China. As the saying goes, the appetite comes with the eating. So, the US faces, I think, two juxtaposed problems. On the one hand, without the Cold War to give its military presence on the Korean Peninsula a larger justification, North Korea is just too small to be a security concern for America. On the other hand, China's too large, too important to the global economy, and too ideologically nebulous for America to challenge it in the same way it faced down Soviet communism. Now, I would argue that as distinctive as those two problems are, they point to the same solution, at least on the Korean Peninsula, which is to say that the United States should get out of South Korea. I wouldn't sugarcoat that. I think getting out of South Korea and potentially ending the alliance with the ROK would be a huge strategic reversal for the United States. But it would have some upsides. At the present moment, China benefits enormously from North Korea's nuclear program because of decoupling, which I described earlier. North Korea's ICBM program erodes America's alliances with South Korea and Japan, which is exactly what Beijing wants. Ultimately, Beijing wants Washington to get out of the region altogether, and one way to do that is to weaken America's alliance structures. So I think there's a tendency among Western analysts to view the North Korean problem exclusively through an American prism, but the US is in Asia by choice. China is North Korea's permanent neighbour. So if China became the preeminent strategic power in Asia, a nuclear-armed North Korea could be a serious and permanent irritant for Beijing. In fact, had China's rise occurred in a world without nuclear weapons, without North Korean nuclear weapons, excuse me, America's options right now would probably be even less palatable than they are. I think the starkest way I can sum up my argument is to ask the following question. Does America want North Korea to give up its capability to threaten American cities with nuclear weapons? Or does it want to maintain its military presence in South Korea? Or I could probably put it even slightly differently to that. Does America want, which does America value more highly? Protecting the homeland from North Korea's ICBMs or maintaining its alliance structure in Asia and its leadership, its strategic leadership of the Asian region? It can't have both, I would argue. And unless it negotiates with Pyongyang, it may end up with neither. Because the deadly combination of decoupling and China's rise is gradually eroding the credibility of America's presence in South Korea anyway. So before the Singapore summit, I argued that Trump should offer a trade. In exchange for North Korea giving up its intercontinental ballistic missiles, the US would permanently withdraw its troops from South Korea. And I argued that the two sides could even begin negotiations on a permanent peace treaty. Now, I should be very specific here. My suggestion was not that America needed to go for North Korean complete denuclearization, which is what the Americans are still insisting on. I just don't think that's realistic. The North Koreans have built this nuclear weapons capacity because they have calculated, I think rightly, that there is nothing else that would guarantee the security of the North Korean regime the way that nuclear weapons can. So I don't think negotiating on the basis of complete denuclearization is realistic. And I should add here that again, the regional angle here, it's not just about North Korea deterring the United States. Even if the United States was out of the picture, North Korea has regional adversaries as well. It's always been suspicious of China, and it's always been suspicious of Japan, and of course South Korea also. So for those reasons, total North Korean disarmament is not likely. It may not even be in American interests. It would remove a thorny problem for China. And so although an American retreat from the Korean Peninsula would be good news for China, I don't think there's any need for Washington to do Beijing any additional favours. So I would argue that the sole objective here should be for the United States to remove the threat of the ICBMs, the threat to the continental United States. Some would argue that it actually would be almost impossible to verify an agreement like that. I think that is a major problem. But on the other hand, there wouldn't be much incentive for North Korea to cheat. After all, getting the United States to withdraw from South Korea is probably why North Korea developed an ICBM in the first place. They want to remove the American threat, what they regard as an American existential threat to their regime. And the way they do it is by developing an ICBM that decouples the United States from its allies. So the North Koreans, even if it would be hard to verify, dismantlement of their ICBMs, they have an incentive not to cheat. Why jeopardise, the attainment of their goal, that is removing American troops from the peninsula, with a clandestine program? And in any case, having reached a settlement with the US of the kind that I'm talking about, Pyongyang wouldn't even need a long-range missile. All its remaining enemies would be close to home. So before the Singapore summit, that's what I argued for. The United States should be prepared to swap its troop presence in South Korea and even its alliance with the South exchange for the North Korean ICBM program. Not a great deal for the United States, but I think the best one going. Now, of course, it didn't go that way in Singapore. We ended up with, I think, a fairly routine statement that didn't really bind either party to anything. And I think, despite the optimism on the US camp, it may slowly dawn on the US president. It perhaps already is, given that he has now directed his Secretary of State to cancel his travel to North Korea. I think it's dawning on the US president that North Korea isn't abiding by the in-principle agreement that was struck in Singapore for North Korea to completely denuclearise. There's a little kernel, though, of optimism, I think, that cockeyed optimism, I suppose, that still resides within me. I think there is room for a substantive deal like the one that I've suggested, because I think Trump has an appetite for it. He has no affection for alliances. It seems to me Trump stands for very little in a substantive sense. There are only a handful of things that he has believed throughout his public life. But one of those is that the United States is being exploited by its allies. Allies strike unfair trade deals with the United States, and then they force America to pay for their defence. That's been his complaint really since the 1980s. When he took out full-page ads in the New York Times in the early 80s complaining that the Japanese were exploiting America. And he really hasn't shifted from that view. So, because Trump has really no affection for alliances and thinks America is being exploited, I do think that America's troop presence on the Korean Peninsula, and potentially its alliance with South Korea, is very much on the table. Even if it's still, I don't think I would argue that it's a likelihood, 50% plus one, but I still think it's on the table, certainly much more than under any other conceivable president. Probably the more serious roadblock on any agreement like that is the administration itself. It's interesting to note that other than Trump himself, there are very few people within his administration who really fully share his worldview. He's found it very difficult to staff his administration, the national security and the foreign policy parts of it, because he can't find people who actually agree with, believe what he believes. Nevertheless, Trump and Kim are nothing if not mercurial, so I don't think we should dismiss the possibility of a grand bargain. It didn't happen in Singapore, but it might happen later. And in fact, I think as difficult as a deal like that would be for America's allies in Asia, globally even, I think America's allies have an interest in encouraging a deal like that. An agreement that leads to the removal of US troops from South Korea would be historic, but the reason the consequences are so vast, really, is that it would be seen, I think, broadly as just the first step in a broader US retreat from the region. Allies, including Australia, would get a clear signal from a deal like that America believes Asia is not worth fighting for. So regional confidence in the US would decline. And over time, the incentive for South Korea, for Japan, and eventually perhaps even Australia to substantially increase their own defence capabilities and maybe even develop their own nuclear weapons capability would grow. But what I've tried to argue today is that thanks to the rise of China, largely, but also thanks to North Korea's ICBM, America's position in the region is eroding quickly anyway. So the US needs to find more solid ground. America's alliance network, its leadership of Asia, is a declining currency. So it needs to make a deal now while those things are still worth something. So the task then, I think, is for the US to negotiate the most favourable terms for its slow, steady withdrawal from the region. It's not going to disappear from the region entirely, of course, and I think that the kind of step I'm advocating here, even if it retreated from South Korea, it would maintain a very substantial presence in Japan, of course, and of course in Australia, and it may even as a result of any Korea deal, it may even strengthen its military presence in Japan and in Australia. And we certainly shouldn't want the United States to disappear from the region entirely. But the leadership in our region is unmistakably in transition. And I think it's in the interest of America's friends and allies in Asia to see that that process of transition happens in the smoothest way possible, and that the US negotiates that shift from a position of strength. So I'll leave it there, and I'll open the floor to you.